Welcome to The Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Mathews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from forest soundscapes to fragile oceans, from the songs of whales and trees to the secret world of microspecies and microbes. In this final episode of the season, I speak with Antone Martinho-Truswell, a fascinating evolutionary biologist, member of the Sydney Policy Lab and the School of Life and Environmental Sciences at the University of Sydney, Australia. His Substack is called The Village Green, and he's author of The Parrot in the Mirror: How Evolving to Be Like Birds Made Us Human, published in 2022. I was very keen that I end the season with our more than human flying kin, and I'm so glad that I found Antone to have this conversation with. In this episode, we look at convergent evolution and how humans are astonishingly bird-like despite our mammalian lineage. Starting from dinosaur ancestry, we discussed longevity, breeding, brains, social lives, and communication that all worked as successful evolutionary adaptations for birds. It may seem so obvious and so trivial, but the most important thing about birds is that they fly. It is their superpower. Antone, in a really interesting article in Aeon magazine, writes of how extraordinary flight is. Flight is, in evolutionary terms, very difficult. He uses astrophysics as a metaphor and writes that it's not wrong to think of highly adapted combinations of traits as having a gravitational pull on organisms that approach them in evolutionary space. Flight is an evolutionary black hole. It is a gravitational well with no bottom, a trait so powerfully effective at improving survival and reproduction that it plunges the species into a well of easy life and high fitness from which there is no escape. For humans and birds, as Antone writes, our futures are expansive, but point interminably to our respective singularities, theirs to flight and ours to culture. In his book, he writes as follows: "And I suspect every human alive or dead has had that dream. You know, the one where you can fly like a bird." Antone, thank you so much for joining us at The Subverse. You're very welcome here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd like to start with the following question, which is that the lineage of our species is mammalian. Yet we find, through your own work, that we find great similarities with many birds that we do not share with other mammals. You write in your book, The Parrot in the Mirror, "Indeed, we are positively bird-like." Are we, in fact, birds not of a feather?
Are we birds not of a feather? Well, do you know, it's funny because the working title of the book was The Bird Without Feathers. It's a reference to the thing with feathers and birds with a feather, and there's all of these phrases that go along with it. So it worked very poetically when I was trying to think of titles. But I think in the end, it's probably better that the title ended up being The Parrot in the Mirror, because the point that I'm getting at is not that humans evolved to be like birds in the sense of what birds were doing was somehow more correct for us, but rather we evolved to be a very extreme version of what a mammal can be. And we did that by falling into what I call an evolutionary groove in the book. It's almost like a gravity well where you fall in and it brings you along with it. So in the case of humans, there's a number of different traits that we have that differ substantially from other mammals. And at first look, it might seem as though they're unrelated differences. But the argument that I'm making is actually they're one difference, and it's that we have fallen into a way of living that requires several adaptations to come together. And as just one example of that, if you are going to have a big brain, but you're going to have very underdeveloped offspring, then you also are going to need to evolve to become socially monogamous so that you have more than one parent around to look after those undeveloped offspring while they grow their big brain after they're born. So differences that we have from other mammals, like our relative intelligence, like our relative monogamy, like our relative, and indeed not just relative, but quite extreme immaturity at birth, at birth age, they actually all come together. They're one suite of evolutionary strategy that we've fallen into. And the argument that I'm making is that birds have also fallen into that evolutionary strategy as distinct from other reptiles. And I don't think I quite hammer home that point in the book as much as I might now, that birds are an offshoot of reptiles. They are dinosaurs. They are one group within it. Most other reptiles do not share those behaviors with birds. Birds and humans have fallen into this unusual behavior that separates them.
In the book, you use the term convergent evolution. Can you tell us what that is?
So that's, in this case, exactly what's happened with this suite of behaviors between birds and humans. Convergent evolution is when two groups of organisms, it might be species, it might be a larger group than that. You could talk about, indeed, I'm talking about convergent evolution with a whole class when I'm talking about birds as a whole. Whichever groups you're comparing, convergent evolution just means that the two groups have ended up with similar traits that their ancestors did not share. So they don't have those traits because they've always had those traits and because they came from the same ancestors. Rather, they have those traits because they face the same challenges and evolved them independent of each other in order to respond to those same challenges in the same way. The absolutely classical example is that birds, bats, and butterflies all have wings. Those wings are derived completely differently anatomically. Wings are skin stretched around their arms. Birds' wings are feathers going out of their arms. Insect wings are a completely separate organ. They're not at all structurally related to each other. They did not evolve together, but they all evolved to respond to the same, in this case, opportunity that flight is great. And flight gives you all sorts of evolutionary advantages. And in each case, they were light enough to take advantage. So that would be an absolutely classic example. Another classic example is a whale's tail looks a lot like a fish's tail turned sideways. That's not because they share a common ancestor that swam, but rather they both were evolving to swim, and that's a pretty straightforward way to be able to swim, and so they evolved an organ to do that. And indeed, seals and sea lions also have fin-like rear feet. In some cases, there's two, and in some cases, they're fused into one, completely unrelated to a whale's fluke, but again, convergently evolved to allow a mammal to swim in the ocean.
Thank you, Antone. If you could tell us a little bit more about the musculature and the wings of a bird. How did they, in fact, evolve to fly?
While Archaeopteryx, the early bird fossil, was discovered quite a long time ago, a lot of this has crystallized within my lifetime. So I remember as a child, we knew that birds were reptile-derived, but it wasn't as clear as it is today that they are the remnant dinosaurs that survived the end Cretaceous extinction. So what we know is that dinosaurs, and in particular dinosaurs like T-Rex or like small raptors or like Archaeopteryx, were developing this upright stance on 2 feet and were feathered before they were flying as an evolved scale. And you can see why feathers would be advantageous even before you fly. Mammalian hair has also evolved from a reptilian scale and provides more insulation than a scale would because it traps air. A feather is another way to start developing that insulation ability. It's fluffier than a smooth scale, and so it holds air, allows you to keep warm, allows you to temperature regulate. And we know that dinosaurs were beginning to become warm-blooded, as against other reptiles, and birds today are warm-blooded. So that regulatory control is an energy saving for them. And then the smaller feathered dinosaurs were probably beginning to take advantage of these feathers with glides and long leaps and that kind of thing, which would have provided a bit of advantage in movement. And then over time, Archaeopteryx probably had, in some sense, winged legs. We think it may have had elongated feathers on its hind legs, so it was really engaging in four-armed gliding. And then over time, you have a loss of the claw tips at the tip of the wing and evolving today into a bird's wing, which really does end in almost a cone of bone. It comes to a point that is entirely specialized for supporting feathers for flight. They're no longer doing any manipulation with their wings. So the other part of this coin is that you have to develop very lightweight bones that are hollow in order to be able to take off. And you have to develop extremely strong chest muscles called the keel in a bird, because it's shaped like a sailboat's keel. They have their equivalent of sternum, instead of being a flat bone like we have, is this great big protruding bone, which if you've ever carved a chicken was there between the chicken breasts. And what it's doing is anchoring that huge musculature that allows them to produce lift. So all of that's essentially, and it's really a very extreme way to evolve. You become in some ways quite physically fragile with those hollow bones. You're compromising on the durability of the rest of the body in order to give all of this muscle and attention to wings. And you're also compromising on having 4 manipulating limbs instead of 2 manipulating limbs. And birds, parrots especially, hold things with their feet, but they've lost the front set of limbs as a way to hold things as a result of doubling down on flight.
Thank you. In fact, we will speak more about flight, but I'm also curious to hear more about some of the other adaptations that changed the evolutionary game. And in your book, for example, you talk about bird brains and that cliche. So if you could speak a little bit more to this.
Yes, well, I've spent a lot of my career explicitly looking into learning, intelligence, cognition in birds. And you invite people to come up and use the cliche. If someone says, "What do you do?" "Oh, I study intelligence in birds." So are they bird brains or not? My very career invites the question, and I've taken a firm line on this, that no, they're not. Even if you take a less intelligent bird, and I say that with love, I did a great deal of my work on ducks. Ducks are mesonath birds, which is just a fancy way of saying that there's in between the paleonaths, which are really unusual things like ostriches and emus and kiwis and the other ratites and tinamous. So you've got this old divergence of birds that are really quite different from the rest of the class. You've got the neonaths, which is everything that we think of as a bird, from penguins to ptarmigans to pigeons. And then in the middle, you've got what you might call farmyard birds, geese, ducks, chickens, and their relatives. Partly by virtue of that and partly by virtue of their particular evolutionary position, they are not as intelligent as some of the really impressive cognitive specialists that you might find in the songbirds or in the parrots. They're a floor model, if you like. If a duck can do it, I'm confident any bird can do it. And I say that with a great love. But ducks are fantastically intelligent compared to mammals, compared to most animals we confront. They're really very impressive. They've got a very sophisticated cognitive ability. They've got sophisticated learning abilities. They learn very quickly. A lot of my scientific work has been on imprinting, which is the process by which birds like ducks and chickens that do hatch out very mature and able to walk and swim pretty much the day that they hatch, they have very robust learning capacities to learn to follow their mother. And I think a lot of people think of that as automatic and not particularly intelligent, but the complexity of the information that they can learn through imprinting is quite impressive. And what we can get chickens doing in experiments is very impressive. And then you only ratchet up from there when you start looking at something like a crow or a parrot, where you're really talking about intelligence that rivals the very smartest primates. And in some cases, in some tasks, surpasses it. It's always tricky to try to rank animals in intelligence because they're evolved for a context. And sometimes they're really good at something because it really suits their context. But I think we can pretty generally put them in a very high category of cognitive ability.
In this context, you also talk about language. I would love to hear a little bit more about that.
I have to be very careful about language because I push up against 2 big fields of study. On the one side, linguistics is its own thing, and I'm not pretending to be a linguist, and I'm not one, although I am very interested. As an evolutionary biologist, a lot of the thinking behind some of linguistics is very familiar to me when I read linguistics texts. I find it fascinating for that reason, that some of the discussion has echoes in what we talk about in evolution. And on the other hand, bird song. I am not a bird song specialist. It's its own whole field of animal behavior and neurology, neurobiology, understanding how bird song works, how it learns. There's a great deal of study done on neuron activation around bird song. But what I've noticed between the 2 of them that was fascinating to me is you have in both cases this pattern which repeats itself both the global and the local scale, that the further you are from the origin of a way of communicating, the simpler that way of communicating seems to get. And by simple, I don't mean less robust or less rigorous. I mean sort of cleaner and winnowed down, or you might say optimized. So in human language, we see this in terms of the number of phonemes that go into a language at the global scale. So the nearer that you are to the origins of human language in Africa, the more number of sounds a language takes advantage of. And by the time you get to the opposite side of the planet in Hawaii, you're down to only about 12 phonemes, whereas some of the languages in sub-Saharan Africa have over 100 phonemes. So you have this winnowing down, and you're still able to communicate all of the meaning that you want to communicate. They're not lesser languages by any stretch in terms of the ideas that they can communicate, but they're doing it with fewer sounds. And it seems to be that there's almost an efficiency gain, that you have to learn fewer sounds, you have less complexity. It's easier to make the sounds as a foreign speaker in Hawaiian than it is in these sub-Saharan African languages, which I'm not saying the names of because they usually involve sounds that I can't make. It's an act of self-preservation. And that's exactly one of the reasons for the pattern. We see it at a more local level as well, that languages that have been the languages of empire, where their speakers have conquered other peoples who have then had to learn the new dominant language as adults, are the languages that get simplified and codified. So I remember when I was learning Latin, if you've ever learned another Romance language, the other Romance languages have a very structured word assembly. So conjugation in Spanish, for example, is very neat and clean, and you put it in grids and it's all very nice. I learned that first, and then I learned Latin. And learning Latin, it almost mathematics by comparison. It's so formulaic. And the reason it's formulaic is because it had to be. It had to be standardized because it was being taught to Celts and Goths and Turks and Egyptians for hundreds of years. And children can pick up all kinds of complexity and difficulty in language that adults who have lost our brain plasticity don't have. And you see this repeated. So Persian is a more codified language. It's simpler in many senses than Pashtun or other languages that were more local and didn't become the language of empire or the language of domination. In birdsong, you have the similar global pattern, which is that when songbirds emerge in Australia, they begin with birds much like the Australian lyrebirds, the two species of lyrebird, which have basically an infinite repertoire. They learn any sound that they hear and they add it to their mating call to produce these wonderfully complex mating performances that also involve human sounds. They replicate the sounds of chainsaws and car horns and camera batteries and anything that they hear. And then as you radiate away, song seems to get simpler. It's not as smooth as human language, but evolution seems to have found the same efficiency, that you don't need to be making that many sounds in order to have a successful song-based mating and communication system. And I'm not sure if that's the same effect happening, but it was a parallelism that I noticed. And you have a similar parallelism with the fact that other than the parrots, birds are overwhelmingly learning their song in infancy and childhood, if you like, chickhood, much like humans have more robust language learning capacity when we're children.
This is so fascinating. And I have to say that I have a particular interest in sound related things. So thank you so much for this. I'd like to speak about one more adaptation, birds and longevity. So why do birds live longer relative to their size? And I found this really fascinating because I'd really never thought about longevity and size.
So within a group of similar animals, the pattern that is pretty much incontrovertible is that the larger you are, the longer you live. And some of understanding why that's the case is really straightforward, which is that on the one hand, you're more robust. If you're bigger, you've got extra stores of energy. You are physically harder to kill. You are physically harder for disease to kill because there is more of you to absorb the impacts. Everything about being bigger, it's true of non-living things as well. It's much easier to flatten out a small hill of dirt than a large hill of dirt. So there's a real physical robustness argument to it. But then there's also an evolutionary investment argument, which is that it takes time for any organism to grow big. And this will become important when we talk about birds in particular. In order to justify that investment, you need to have time for it to pay off reproductively. So a larger animal that takes an extra year to grow to its full size, in order for that to make sense, it's a little bit of an after-the-fact justification. But to put it another way, an animal that is going to eventually have 5 opportunities to mate and produce offspring can invest more in becoming big and robust and hard to kill by having a longer growing period. And so you see these capacities evolve together, which is that being big can be justified if you're going to live a bit longer to support the growth period. That's true whether you're a mammal or bird. What's really surprising is that a mammal and a bird of the same weight have vastly different lifespans, and the bird lives a lot longer. And at the small end is to some extent where it's the most impressive, where a mouse and a sparrow, where the mouse is actually probably a bit heavier than the sparrow, a mouse might live 2 years at a push, and a sparrow can live 20, particularly in captivity. Their physical capacity for repairing their body, for keeping their organs working, for maintaining homeostasis is much, much better, dramatically better. And that pattern is true throughout mammals and birds, that more or less it diminishes as you get to the bigger end. But you get something along the lines of anywhere from a 10-fold to a 2 or 3-fold increase in lifespan if you're a bird as against a similarly sized mammal. The reason for that is flight. And the most obvious reason is that flight makes you harder to kill. Any predator that doesn't fly is going to have a very hard time catching and killing a flying animal. But that's true of birds even when there are no predators around. So if you lock the sparrow and the mouse in a room with no cats and an infinite amount of food, the bird is still going to outlive the mouse. And the reason for that, which is, I suppose, one of the most complicated ideas that I had to bring across in my book, is the difference between what biologists call K selection and R selection. I'm not going to get too bogged down in those terms. But basically, it comes down to a live fast, die young strategy, which is R selection, and a live slow, die old strategy, which is K selection. So K selected animals, which includes really all birds. There aren't very many short-lived birds. There are a couple of interesting counterexamples, but for the most part, birds live a long time for their size universally. And they're investing a lot of time in each individual group of offspring. They're living in order to have many reproductive events. They're not doing what we see in some other groups of animals, particularly in, say, fish or reptiles, where you have hundreds and hundreds of babies on the expectation that most of them will die and you're not going to look after them. Now, what does flight have to do with that? If you already fly and so are safe from predators, your next year, your next breeding season is very likely, because you're not likely to be killed by some extrinsic happenstance like being caught by a predator. If you don't fly, like a mouse, your next breeding season is really not a guaranteed thing. So strategically, in that moment, for a mouse, it always makes sense to put more investment into the current moment, because your chance of actually living to give it another crack next year is pretty low to begin with. So some of the calculation that we humans might make, which is say, I don't want to exhaust myself. I don't want to use up all of my food stores. I don't want to take any unnecessary risks, because next year has almost the same value to me as this year. My health is reasonably good. That doesn't apply to a mouse. Chances are something's going to kill it. Next year basically doesn't exist in its calculus, or if it does, it exists with a very low probability. Or a sparrow, next year is overwhelmingly likely to come. So it makes sense to take things easy, have a few babies, spend plenty of time looking after them. You can always have another clutch next year and spend plenty of time looking after those. It gives you time in a probability sense that you can take advantage of. Now, neither of these animals are making this decision consciously, but natural selection is pushing one in one direction and the other in another direction. So any trait that encourages the mouse to bet the whole farm and get it done this year is selected for in the mouse, but selected against in the sparrow, because the probability of the sparrow having next year to look forward to is much higher. And that starts with flight and then becomes a self-sustaining cycle, because if you already have genes for good body repair, for looking after your organs, for maintaining homeostasis, that makes next year even more likely to come. And so it runs away with itself. It starts with flight and runs away to become this wonderful virtuous cycle where you live longer and longer, because each of those adaptations makes next year more and more valuable. That was a bit long-winded, but it's a fascinating interplay.
It's a fascinating topic. Antone, when there was an asteroid collision and consequent climate change, was flight one of the reasons that birds survived?
You could call it flight, or you could call it the size that came with flight. So the reason I say it is it's really hard to tease apart. When the end Cretaceous extinction event happened, almost nothing that weighed more than 25 kilograms and lived above the sea surface survive that. The exceptions are overwhelmingly aquatic animals. So the leatherback sea turtle survived and is huge. But anything living on land over 25 kilograms, with very rare exceptions, went extinct because of the lack of food caused by reduced plant productivity with reduced sunshine and climate change. That's then hard to tease apart from, is it because of flight explicitly, or is it because those animals that flied were necessarily lightweight? And if you're necessarily lightweight, your nutrition requirements are lesser, you can get by on less. Now, on the other hand, flight itself means you can have a much larger foraging range than if you just walk. So if food is scarce and you're looking for food and you're able to fly, then you can roam further and you can graze on more food resources. So they probably go hand in hand, but body weight is a big part of it as well. Having a reduced body weight that let them fly was already an advantage in terms of surviving that extinction event.
Thank you. Here you've got me thinking about something else which I was very curious about, which is about energy requirements, because you do talk about how extraordinary flight is and how extraordinary movement is. So if you could speak a little bit about that topic.
Yes, so I make the point, and I hope it's not too simplistic or too obvious, that movement is a pretty impressive biological feat. When you consider how life begins, which is as microorganisms, that yes, they move around their microscopic environment, a droplet of water, but they're really not moving from place to place. The environment that they have found themselves alive in is basically the only environment that they'll ever confront. Then you have completely fixed organisms that develop with multicellular life, like plants, fungus. There's protists like kelp, which people think of as plants, but are a different kingdom of life, in fact, that are all completely fixed in one place. And that makes some sense when you think that any living thing is basically a very large, complex, sustained chemical reaction. And any chemical reaction needs to have its reagents at hand for it to run. And so adaptations that trees or kelp or fungus have, where they drill part of their body down into a source of those reagents and suck them up and use them, that's much more straightforward to see how you pull that off evolutionarily. Life exists where its resources are, fine. Wrapping all of the processes of life in a waterproof bag, and particularly being able to move around outside of the ocean. If you think of any mammal, you think of a dog walking around, where a dog is a waterproof container of incredibly complex chemical reactions, managing its intake and its outtake, and moving around, spending energy to take this whole chemical reaction miles in one direction and then miles in another. It's astonishing that selection has managed to come up with all of the systems that are required to make that happen. And that's why the organs and the body systems of animals are so much more complex than the organs and body systems of plants. And plants are fantastically complex, but the level of macro organization inside of an animal as compared to inside of a plant reflects the fact that getting the whole system moving around was very impressive. But that gives you movement in two dimensions. And I'm talking about this out of the water. Things in the water are evolving on easy mode because they're bathed in a solution that contains a lot of their nutrients and their reagents. Fish are quite complex and quite sealed off, but you think of something like a coral, where it's really bathing in its medium, almost the way that a unicellular organism is bathing in its medium. But up on land, you're moving in two dimensions if you're an animal, to then add a third dimension of flight, because it's hard, because you have to fight gravity, because you have to deal with the size versus weight ratio, because you have to generate enough energy to achieve liftoff. The evolutionary advantage of it is huge because it's rare. It's hard to do. And that means that once you're able to fly and take advantage of that third dimension, by default, most other animals can't, which means the ones that would compete with you can't compete for the resources that you can access by flying, and the ones that would like to eat you can't get you. So it unlocks an entire dimension of movement and of opportunity for an animal that can pull it off. The only reason every animal isn't flying to take advantage of that is that it is really very hard. You make a lot of sacrifices to be able to fly, which we've talked about, whether that be the physical robustness, loss of hands, the energy requirements.
Great. I'd like to now see where this movement led. So in an article in Aeon magazine titled Empire of Flight, You set out to answer the question, why don't birds drive Bentleys? So why don't they?
So the humorous title was getting at the idea that has been expressed by people other than me, but that I'm very fond of, which is to call birds the near miss at human-like intelligence. And the reason I like that is because, on the one hand, I've spent a lot of time thinking about what makes birds and humans so similar evolutionarily. And a lot of those traits that we share are exactly the traits that allowed us to become the planet-dominating cultural animal that we are. And it's our complex culture that has really allowed our intelligence to, if you like, stack on itself to achieve complexity that no other animal has. Our ability to make things, to develop concepts that contain concepts within them. We celebrate as behavioral scientists when we get an animal showing that it understands one degree of abstraction, like sameness or difference. But we think about how many degrees of abstraction go into a human concept like democracy. Those levels of abstraction rely on culture, cultural transmission, developing them over multiple generations, handing them on from one to another, having the communicative ability to do all of that. Birds come close at a lot of the raw material for those capacities. They've got substantial intelligence. They've got communication with each other. They've got long lives and overlapping generations where they could hand things on and do hand things on from one generation to another. So songbird songs are learned from their parents, and birds learn from their parents and do hand on information. And they even have the beginnings of what you might call culture in their sounds and in their behaviors, and they learn strategies from each other. They can do all of this, but they have not taken that next step. And it's not that they're not choosing not to. They probably don't quite have the ability to take that next step at developing robust, complex culture. Some people like to get upset with me for saying, how do you know they don't have complex culture? And oh, they're not driving Bentleys. They don't have Veblen goods. They don't have economic models. They're not doing some of the outcomes that we would expect from that. And I'm not denigrating birds by saying that they're not. I hope you can tell. I think they're very impressive. But for whatever reason, evolution is a game of needs. It's not that they're choosing not to do these things. They haven't needed to do these things in order to survive. And I think that the reason they haven't done those things is because flight is such a powerful adaptation for them. So all of those advantages that I was talking about, where flight puts you literally, physically on a different plane from other animals. Evolution is a game of pressure. It's about stress being put on a species, and natural selection allows the species to respond to those stresses by developing new strategies. And it's a negative game. It never aspires to anything. It only responds to inadequacy. The result of that is that if you're doing very well, if everything is going really well, there's not pressure to change and to develop new strategies. And I think to some extent, flight and the ability to outrun just about any predator, to live for a very long time, to rove about and have access to all sorts of food on a huge range, that takes away a huge amount of the evolutionary pressure for birds to do anything that's radically different from what they're already doing. It obviously doesn't take away the evolutionary pressure to differentiate yourself within that model, which is why there are so many species of birds. There are far more species of birds than there are of mammals. And that's because, given a lack of hard survival pressure, there's lots and lots of room to diversify and distinguish within that, to take advantage of empty niches, to take advantage of opportunities that flight allows in one way or another. You can eat fruit, or you can eat seeds, or you can eat other animals, or there's lots of ways to live as a bird. And it's always advantageous to find an area of low competition. If your neighbors are eating fruit, well, maybe you should eat fish, because then you're not going to be competing for the fruit. So lots of room for diversity within being a bird. But what I put forward in this Aeon article, which is only a hypothesis, is that the ability to fly and take away so much of the hard edges of natural selection has left birds with an infinite variety of nearby paths that they can take, but no pressure to go somewhere radically different, like to develop the level of culture that we have.
Thank you so much, Antone. And I love the metaphor that you use in the article of the evolutionary landscape.
So it'll be common to anyone who's studied a bit of evolutionary biology to think of the evolutionary landscape as having peaks and troughs of fitness. And we can define fitness a lot of different ways, but a really standard way to do that is how many offspring you produce in the next generation. So the landscape, you think of it as a three-dimensional graph of, say, two traits being modeled on the horizontal axis, and then the vertical axis is how fit you are, how many offspring you're able to produce. And then different combinations of those two traits result in different peaks and troughs in the landscape that are more or less fit. And obviously, any one animal has hundreds and hundreds of traits, everything down from their color to the particular level of acidity that they produce in this or that organ. It's thousands of variables. So we simplify it down to just a couple of variables when we think about an evolutionary landscape. But it's a sort of a rubber sheet model where some areas are high, some areas are low. And normally we think of going up as good, high fitness. You're going to do very well. So you're going to be up high on this mountaintop and you've climbed up there by your evolutionary efforts. What I don't like about that model is it makes the process of natural selection too intentional. So climbing a mountain requires the intention to be at the top of a mountain. Whereas if we flip this model on its head, and instead of modeling fitness, we think of it as how much trouble is it to stay alive and have some babies and to pass on your genes to the next generation. And a really well adapted, a really optimized and efficient animal is one where that effort is very low. So I model the high fitness as low relative survival effort and flip the model on its head to where natural selection wants to push you down into the valleys. And that's a lot less intentional because we think of it in terms of gravity. A ball will roll down to its lowest space. It's an automatic process. It's easier to live down there. It's lower energy. It's equilibrium. There's so many physics metaphors that we can use. I really like that model because it both gives you the sense that evolution is going to happen to you rather than you are going to evolve. But it also adds this element where being at your maximum fitness or at your minimum effort to survive is to be down in a hole. And a hole is hard to get out of. You're stuck in some sense by your own success because any slight change that you might make to say move towards a different way of living is going to make life harder. You're climbing up this slope. And evolution happens slowly. If you're going to develop a radically different way of living, chances are you're not going to do that in one swift jump. You're going to have to climb that hill agonizingly out of your valley. And that actually makes it very hard. It models well why whenever we ask an evolutionary question, like, pandas, why won't pandas eat something else? They would do so much better if they could eat something other than bamboo. Well, the answer is that they are tightly evolved to eat bamboo. An overall change to be able to eat anything would be great. But all of the steps in the meanwhile mean being less good at eating bamboo without being particularly good at eating anything else. So they're trapped at this local minima of effort. And yes, there would be lower effort ways to live somewhere else, but they have to traverse a section of higher effort to get there. And they won't move through that unless they jump or unless their environment changes all of a sudden. So in modeling in my head and in thinking through this, basically the conclusion I came to is that flight is such a deep well of evolutionary success. It's such an enormous gravitational attractor that I think of it as a kind of evolutionary black hole. You fall into it, its effect is enormous in terms of the evolutionary benefit it gives you, but then you cannot get out. You're stuck down in there. And then I was thinking about black holes and thinking about, well, our physics models say that inside of a black hole, you have infinite space, but limited time, which I thought was a very nice metaphor for what I said earlier about birds, where they have within the whole of flight, they have infinite options for how to live, but their future is always flight. They're not going to break away from that. And the birds that do end up flightless because of profound environmental differences. They're on an island where the advantages of flight don't exist any longer because there are no ground-dwelling predators. Or they're so huge, like an ostrich, that the advantages of flight disappear because they simply cannot fly and have to capitalize on something else. So there are ways out, but they rely on the landscape being different rather than simply on another strategy being better than flight. Those strategies aren't better than flight. When rats come to New Zealand, they kill the flightless birds. When the environment goes back to the standard environment, if you like, flight wins, or rather flightlessness loses.
This is so brilliant. Thank you, Antone. You also write that while birds are in their black hole, humans are also in their black hole.
Yes, something that a lot of biology students, I thought that they often have, is to think that modern human life has meant the end of evolution for us. We are no longer being selected for by death, which is what natural selection is. It's the death of those who cannot survive long enough to reproduce. And that we now mercifully have wonderful systems in place to make sure that any number of circumstances or conditions that might have led someone to die before they could reproduce in our deep past are no longer the case. And that's great. But then they ask the question, does that mean that we're no longer evolving? And we are able to track a number of different ways that humans, through simple happenstance or mixture or sexual selection, there's all sorts of ways that our particular genetic and evolutionary outlook is changing a little bit. But it's also the case that we are not under grave evolutionary pressure. So a bit like the argument that I make about flight, we have found in becoming the cultural ape, in having complex culture that's able to support things like modern medicine and welfare programs and looking after people who wouldn't be able to survive in the wilderness, we have taken away some pressure that was selecting for radical change in our behavior, probably some of the pressure that pushed us towards becoming a cultural ape. Our near relatives, in terms of chimpanzees and the other great apes, spend a huge amount of their time foraging for food, to stay alive, to avoid starvation. Almost no human on Earth would have to spend anywhere near as much time. It's an order of magnitude difference of what we spend making sure that we do not starve to death. That's not to say have high quality food and exactly the one that we want and exactly the amount that we want. But there is more than enough food for humans on Earth. And there's distribution problems. I'm not getting into the geopolitics of that. The question of can we get enough food for humans to survive is solved. We have solved that with minimal human time if we then distribute that food correctly. No animal on Earth lives that way. Not even the birds that can fly, and they still spend vastly more of their time gathering food than we do. Just that is such an enormous change to the pressure on us and to what the priorities are that we need to respond to, that I think we can call that a similar evolutionary black hole. I do not see what circumstances would cause us to evolve away from the complex culture that we have. And if you want to go really post-apocalyptic and take away all of our technology and our electronics and hit us with a solar radiation that destroys all of our ability forever to have modern technology, we're still going to be writing things down and having monetary systems of exchange and all of the abstract parts of being a complex ape. Because the advantages of that, we lived for a very long time without electricity and without relative food shortage compared to other animals. Those advantages are not going away. And I don't really see any way for us to go out of it. Once you have those capabilities, you are deep in an evolutionary black hole because not being under starvation pressure is already head and shoulders above just about every other living thing.
I'd like to now wind up with the following question, something that I really thought about when I read your work, which is that one difference that we have from birds is our capacity for violence and destruction and cruelty. Also talking about flight, we do create machines that can fly. And you also have your aerial weaponry, your drones and your missiles, yes. And then you have satellites and other things. So how do we then share that aerial space with, let's say, our winged kin? And what can we learn from our kin in terms of our capacity and talent for violence?
Oh, what a good question. So I think the advantages of being able to use the extra dimension of movement that is moving through the air, the speed that it affords, the difficulty of getting at you, the isolation that it gives you from other dangers. As soon as we were able to figure it out, we bought in hard on being able to fly with mechanical assistance. That's certainly the case in the history of war, where you see in the scope of a single lifetime, you go from the very first human-powered flight to landing on the moon. We saw the advantages of being able to fly, and we ran or flew with that in a very big way. And I think at a cultural level, those advantages are very similar to the advantages that birds get out of them. It's just a hugely freeing capability as against the difficulty of moving around down on the ground. It takes obstacles out of your way. It takes all the obstacles out of your way. It's great for the military. It's great for international travel. It's great for sending parcels from the United States to Australia. It has enormous advantages. In terms of the violence, I mean, we do have a great capacity for organized violence. But we live relatively peaceful lives compared to most animals. We, for the most part, do not fear being killed by random happenstance as nature ridden tooth and claw. We're not being mauled by bears. It happens. But we go about our lives for the most part without that fear. Most animals that are not apex predators are spending most of their life looking over their shoulder because it's the absolutely expected thing that something will try to eat them at some point. Now, that's different from organized violence. If you like, the downside of our complex culture, which has not at all proven to be a big enough downside to make complex culture disadvantageous, is that just as it lets you build concepts like democracy, it lets you build scaffolded complex concepts like enemy, like hate. I think it would be very hard to argue that any animal can hate in the way or can hold the idea of an enemy the way that a human can. An animal can certainly develop a very strong association between a specific other animal that it knows will treat it badly. I mean, we see this when animals that interact with humans that mistreat them know exactly which humans are going to mistreat them and cower as you would expect and try to avoid it. I saw this today without mistreating an animal, taking my daughter to school. We go on a cargo bike to school, and it's just the beginning of spring here in Sydney. And one famous thing about Australian birds is they swoop. So there are several species here that like to dive bomb as part of their natural behavior, anything that they think is a threat to their nest. And one of the consequences of that is that humans are seen in some cases as a threat, not always. But an interesting aspect of it is that specific humans will come to be seen as a threat. And up until this year, I've never been a threatening human, but there is a bird outside of my daughter's preschool that has decided I am a threat. And it hits me in the same spot on the pavement on my bike every single time I ride past. So they're capable of identifying someone or something that they think is a threat and that they don't want to be around. But they're not conceiving that of this cyclist coming by as a deep-seated philosophical objection to my existence as a bird, and I must defend my right to live here. They're not constructing any of that. They're just, this could be a threat to me being alive. I need to keep it away from me and my potential offspring. Fine. You need cultural intelligence to be able to construct an idea like an enemy with the richness that humans have. That then underpins the rest of the violence is technological. We can build a gun to shoot a person, or we can build a gun to go target shooting, or we can build a gun to hunt for food that we need. We have a magnificent capacity for technology and to devise all sorts of technologies that do nothing but kill. But it's the ability to want to kill someone specific that then allows us to have that organized violence. And that's a natural consequence of being able to have rich scaffolded concepts. And we need to have some, what's the word I'm looking for? Hygiene about what we do with that conceptual capacity. In terms of sharing space with birds, we're getting better at this in terms of recognizing that the environments that we create cause problems for birds' expectations. A very good example is mirrored skyscrapers are a real problem because a bird sees clouds and blue sky in the mirror of the skyscraper and flies right into it. And there are some interesting solutions to this, like letting the windows get dirty, that have been tried in various places. I wouldn't say that we're particularly far along the question of how do we share space with any of the natural world. We have a tendency to try to solve that by fencing it in and saying this is a preserve where we're not going to change things. But I actually think there's room in urbanism and in planning and in civil architecture and civil discussion about what our human habitations are going to look like. To think about the question, it doesn't matter how densely we pack cities, that the modern scale are huge. They are bigger than the entire range of some animals. They're not a dot on a map. They're the size of a mountain. We need to build them in a way that makes room for animals in them, not outside of them. And I think this idea that we're going to save wildlife only by density, I'm here for the density argument that denser human habitation is on the whole good for wildlife, but it's not complete. And there are very good ways of having less dense human habitation that's very harmonious with wildlife. It doesn't have to be pristine and unchanged, but it's about thinking about how do you make room for the natural world to go on doing what it needs to do. It doesn't have to do exactly as it was doing in a preserve. It has to do it adequately everywhere. If we plop a city in the middle of a range, that's going to affect those animals, even if there's plenty of space either side.
I'm so happy we ended with this because it's so important. We need to think about how we share the space with the more than human. If there's some parting thoughts that you'd like to share or some messages that you think are really important for our audience to hear, something that we haven't covered.
I think that last item that we finished on is really important. I think thinking about, I like to call it broad sustainability. So it's very important that we think about narrow sustainability, which is a very big topic of discussion right now in terms of energy consumption, in terms of resource use. But I like to think of an idea of broader sustainability that is, we take up physical space. We take up all kinds of resources beyond just the ones that we account for. And we are an animal. We are part of the natural world. We do not have to excuse ourselves from a landscape entirely to be able to look after it properly and have more of a stewardship mindset that says we want to be in this space and using this space, but we want this space to have equilibrium, to continue to be able to sustain both us and the other natural processes that are happening here. And I think that broader idea of sustainability shouldn't take the place of sort of energy sustainability, which is a really important piece. It has to do with the climate of the whole planet. That can't go away. It has to be added on to it. The job isn't wholly done just because we're not pumping out CO2. We're still pumping out CO2, but suppose we get that under control. The job's not wholly done. We're still taking up space and using up physical resources and water and minerals and planting space, arable land, all of that. And we need to think about how we do that in a way that is integrative with the rest of the natural world. I think there's a really important bit of work to be done that draws together agriculture and urbanism and architecture and planning. And it's a really multidisciplinary field that has to do with broad sustainability. And I'd really like to see that take off a little bit more. And it's beginning to happen, but it is sometimes built too much around a sort of a ring fencing attitude as opposed to an integrative attitude, for which I would plug the great Christopher Alexander, who was professor of architecture at Berkeley and but wonderfully broad ranging in terms of thinking about some of these things. And I would also plug my Substack, The Village Green.
Thank you so much, Antone, for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks to Antone Martinho-Truswell for sharing his thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on social media at Dark and Light Zine. The Subverse is produced for us by Tushar Das. A special thank you to Julian Way, who helped me record at Kumquat Studio, and Daniel Schwenger for helping organize this. So long, and thanks for listening.